Greetings, friends. I am Ian McKenzie, one of the producers of the event Fugitive Futures, and we are just over 1 week away from kicking off the full summit, the full gathering that we've spent a year assembling, actually behind the scenes. And there's a number of fantastic guests and speakers and workshops and a lot of beautiful offerings within this summit to come. And I'm delighted to be welcomed by a special guest who's going to help us make our proper approach to that time on the trail of beauty and fugitive futures. And I'm going to introduce him now in a moment. But thank you all for gathering us for this live conversation. And so a few words of Dr. Martin Shaw, and then a little personal introduction. So Master Storyteller Dr. Martin Shaw provides mythic approaches for the rite of passage that becoming a real human being entails. Internationally renowned author and mythologist, Shaw has almost 30 years' experience working as a wilderness guide. This combination of rites of passage, leadership, and command of many ancient myths and folktales have made him one of the most electrifying teachers working today. And I can say, having met Martin over almost a decade, I think, ago, that I've had the great good fortune to meet a few times, one in a 1,000-year-old pub in Devon, near Devon. We've spoken with him on the podcast as well, the Mythic Masculine. As well, we've journeyed to what does it mean to be in the time of the underworld. And always, he's a pleasure to have on Dr. Martin Shaw. And so I'm delighted to welcome him to this conversation here today on Trailing Beauty. Welcome, Martin.
Hi, Ian. Nice to see you. Hello, everybody.
Well, once again, here we are, back in the saddle. And well, it's quite an auspicious time that, here we are a day or so out of the inauguration in the US, which I'm sure, I wonder what's making its way over there, your side over in England. And yeah, I wonder if you might just give us a report of what's, rippling out there.
Well, I think that the kind of sheer voltage of outrage that was present in 2016 over in England, I must admit, we've almost moved into sort of a fantastical level of almost sort of toxically mythological moments with Hitler salutes and everything going on so fast that we can barely keep up to it. But we've got kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome from last time, so we've all started sort of twitching and just waiting for the next barrage of tweets. And my focus would be don't give it focus. Just don't. Attend to things of weight and goodness in your own life and give your retinas a rest. Social media can really create a kind of devilment in our own head, which makes us less useful for all the good things that can be happening. So by all means, plan your counterattacks, get your war plans out if you have to, but don't give excessive energy to it, would be my counsel.
Well, this is such an interesting time again, I use that euphemistically because it's terrifying and also somehow optimistic. I mean, again, depending on what the perspective you're in. And it feels like to see or to sense make through myth seems absolutely the only way, or at least a necessary way, to make sense of the times, because otherwise they seem completely incomprehensible, it seems to many.
Yes. You've probably heard me say before, Ian, that psychology and mythology do slightly different things. So what you get from psychology, which is hugely useful, is when something like this happens, psychology has the capacity and the intelligence to reduce the flame on it and really pick underneath quite what is going on. And by the reduction of the heat, by removing some of the steam out of the thing, you can divine it soberly. Whereas myth tends to function in a different way, where it tends to amplify and make even more dramatic quite what is going on. So we see We see the proportions of the dilemma writ large rather than reduced.
Mm.
And the irony at the moment is the myth can barely keep up with what's actually happening in front of our own faces at this time. So it is a time to be turning to old stories. It is a time to be reading and studying the notion of the monster, what you do when you are facing into certain types of darkness. As I've said before, what we learn from especially Greek myth, is whenever you are facing a monster, don't keep looking directly in its face. It'll just burn you out. What you need is a shield where you gaze on the reflection of the thing. And the shield itself both protects your eyes, but also is your art. It's your skillfulness. It is the mediating ground between you and whatever horror you happen to be facing at the time. So those are the
Mm.
kind of things that have been in my mind over the last couple of days.
Mm. Mm. Well, we've certainly begun now our
Yeah,
conversation today, and
I
the
know.
theme of it is trailing beauty, which you offered up when we asked, what might be compelling to speak to as we also approach this Fugitive Futures gathering. And I'd love for you to speak a bit of that inspiration of what does it mean to trail beauty as opposed to chase, perhaps,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And what does it mean, or what kind of beauty is worth trailing?
Mm, brilliant. So to trail beauty comes from a very old Arthurian idea. It comes from the image that outside Camelot, deep in the forest somewhere, there is this creature, and the creature would be part serpent, part lion, and part goat. And anybody, whether it is Merlin or Guinevere or Morgana Le Fay or Galahad, whenever they have any time off, whenever Arthur has any time off, they're out in the forest trailing this thing that they call the questing beast. But the irony of the thing is that the disclosure of wisdom comes in the trailing, not in the capture. There's no trapping attached to a beast like that. And so if you take that idea, you could think that many of the artists we love and the poets and the musicians are out there trailing the questing beast. And I realized a long time ago when I first started to tell stories that it was crucially important that the stories were never too breathlessly corralled by me. To use language, forgive me, you've heard me say before, it's to do with a courtship rather than a seduction. It's to do with a song, not chloroform. Otherwise, stories won't hang around you for very long, or they'll just turn into a pamphlet or a mission statement. They won't feel like real nutrition. So, trailing beauty has become more and more important to me as I get older. Beauty is a difficult word, I think, for us to use because it can feel so generic and it can feel like a word that we've already negotiated and come up lacking. I don't know what your childhood was like, but I think for a
Mm.
lot of us, we grow up and at some point we see a film or a movie, or there's someone particularly sportsmanlike or brilliant or incredibly beautiful in the class, and we get the message that is what beauty is, and you, my friend, come up lacking. Um, so that kind of beauty is something that I think we need to be extremely wary of, because it creates a situation where over time, by adolescence, we have folded our wingspan so profoundly. We are trying to cover our own character. We're trying to cover our own body because actually most of us are desperately ashamed of it one way or another. So as soon as you bring up the notion of beauty, the first thing that I really wanted to flag was the trouble with it. There are
Mm.
two types of trouble. One kind of trouble, which we will get to, I think is the stuff of life and absolutely fantastic. But beauty as an ornamental set of dictates pressuring our lives is something to be broken open. You're to wake from that. It is a diminishment, and it's a kind of beauty that can only function by making everything around it smaller, because it is in itself constantly starving. So the
Mm,
questing beast is nothing like that. The questing beast is this. Well, here's probably the most important thing that I'm going to say this evening. And it actually doesn't really come from me. It comes, in essence, from Edgar Allan Poe, the great kind of Gothic romantic. And
mm,
it's this: beauty is not a quality, beauty is an effect.
mm,
Beauty is not a quality, it's an effect. So, in other words, what you think is beautiful, what I think is beautiful, what the Tibetans think is beautiful, what the Russian Orthodox think is beautiful, what the Amazonians think is beautiful, can be radically different. But one of the things that you can notice when beauty has announced itself in the longhouse is the effect that it actually has. And usually, a tenderizing somewhere around the heart. You're less likely to make crazy decisions when, and this would be a nice way of thinking about it, it's not that you are beautiful, but beauty has you.
mm,
Beauty
mhm.
has you or moves through you. Because there's another form of beauty that you get in myth. And I can think of two examples. The first example would be Isolde from that very famous story, Tristan and Isolde. Isolde, they say of her, they say it ironically, her mother is also called Isolde to make it complicated. Isolde's mother, when she walks into a room, they say it's like dawn has broken. It's wonderful. But when her daughter comes into the room, it is like the sun at midday. And everyone else, this is the key, everyone else feels more beautiful by being in the presence of Isolde.
Mm,
So, in other words, there is a generative quality to beauty that is absolutely nothing like the first description that I gave you, that is a diminishment, really, if you don't follow the rules. Isolde's beauty, and they never really say what it is. It's not a description of her physical appearance. It could be the way that she plays the harp, it could be the irrepressible gurgle of her laugh. But there's something about her that radiates and raises up everybody around her. It's interesting. The early descriptions of the Celtic saints were less about um, incredibly miraculous qualities, although there's plenty of that in it. It was more to do with how did you feel when you left that person's presence? How did you
mm,
feel when you left that person's presence? Was something transmitted from them to you that opened up more possibilities in this world? That's usually how you recognize somebody that is walking a path of beauty. So Isolde, that's the kind of thing you want to be around. That is a generative energy in the world. And I'm thinking of another guy in Irish myth, Diarmid, son of Divney. Dermot, son of Divney, in the English pronunciation. Now, he's a friend of this character, Finn McCool, who I tell many stories about. Diarmid has a mark on his face. It's called the love spot. And if you see Diarmid, if you see the mark, you cannot help but fall into a swoon for him. It is just, don't take it personally. There's nothing that can be done about it. It's just beauty. And most of the time, Diarmid is responsible with this, and he actually keeps it hidden under a hat, a bit like this. But if you do see it, you're going to be receiving strong love energy that you will want. Then you can't help but fall in love with the guy. Now, here's the thing: I would have been telling his stories for getting on for 20 years, and I've realized that everybody has a love spot. Everybody has a love spot. As usual, myth have described an incredible moment in our lives when somebody is sitting in front of you and the energy just comes into the room and they start to talk directly about what they truly love. Not a sophisticated pleasure they've learnt to appreciate, but the stuff that is right front and center in the valves of their most archaic, secretive heart. That's the kind of stuff when the love spot reveals itself. If you're a storyteller, you want to hope that you have a love spot when you're telling stories. So that radiates out. The key is not to fall in love with the storyteller, by the way, just so you know. It's the story doing the work. You know, they return back into their puppet form when it's finished. So, just to start us off, that's two really different ideas about the trouble that comes with beauty, I think.
Mm. Thanks, Martin. I mean, I'm stuck with that. If it could be perhaps distilled of this idea that true beauty is generative. Is that kind of what I'm hearing as well? Has a quality of generativity versus, diminishment?
Yes. So, I mean, if you the word beauty itself has some of the Anglo-French in it, beaut, and that means goodness and courtesy. So, isn't that interesting? To be beautiful is connected to how you behave. It's actually
Mm.
connected. It has a kind of ethical core that people don't normally think of. In fact, I'm often wary of extremely beautiful people because they have, on occasion, let's say, on occasion, that very beauty has provided such a dynamic passport into the world. Some other part of them has often become a bit corrupted.
Mm.
So I'm a bit wary about that. I see how they've played that card and expect a certain reaction. But in reality, the etymology, we should have our dear friend Stephen Jenkinson out for this, the etymology of the thing, goodness and courtesy. So, in other words, you can practice becoming beautiful by how you behave to others. It's right there in the word itself. That is less whimsical for me. That is more grounded. It has more substance. And then, as I said a few minute ago, it becomes actually a way of being in the world. So to use that phrase I used, beauty has you. You know, it's not just that you are beauty, you are courting beauty. So you could be the occasional repository of its energy. And if you get really good at it, maybe a bit more sustained.
Mm. Hmm. I'm struck by maybe a parallel between this idea of the muse. I think, right? An old understanding of the muse is it's not sort of one's genius that you possess, but it's like you're inhabited if you, take the proper courtship and humility to receive genius or muse, if that's similar. And I wonder, is that also how you're speaking a bit about this, to be inhabited by beauty?
Yeah, I would say so. And ironically, what you need for that is a work ethic. It doesn't sound
Hmm.
very glamorous, and it isn't glamorous because something like beauty, the way art works is counterweight. So some of you will have heard me say before, it's in my very first book, wildness is the dance partner of discipline. This is familiar. I practically got this tattooed on
Mm.
my chest. And I am befuddled in many ways, but I'm a hard worker, and I always was. And I always recognized the incredible opportunity that was presented to me that I could do this for my joyful labors in this world. I could tell stories and think and all of that stuff. So the way that I trail beauty is not actually by being in a particularly ecstatic state most of the time. I just show up at the desk and I start to write, or I start to talk, or I go out and try and be useful for other people, you know. So that's where I think the generativity is, and that's where the labor is. But if you just sit on a beanbag, there's nothing wrong with a beanbag, waiting to have, it's not about how you feel about the thing. This is a very old issue. What you have to do, to use a word that again, it risks fatigue in my life because I keep repeating it, but it's to do with fidelity. It
Mm.
seems that beauty is most attracted to something that shows fidelity in you, that you keep turning up, and it isn't dependent on the highs and lows of your checked in emotional state. You probably know that about 4 or maybe 5 years ago now, I did a 101-day vigil in a Dartmoor wood on Devon that was quite life changing for me. And one of the reasons it was that long was that I knew at some point emotionally I would peak. And the question was, would I then have the resolve to continue for the other, 64 nights?
Mm.
Or would I actually go, well, I feel full, and I'm back home. but I had said I was going to do it. It was going to be this amount of time, and that was what played out. So ironically, I think if beauty does have a quality of the muse about it, or the daimon, or the angel. Actually, yeah, D.H. Lawrence has a great line. He says, D.H. Lawrence says, who's that knocking on the door? It is the three strange angels. Admit them, admit them, admit them. And you're going to get that in the Old Testament. There's a character called Jacob who spends a night wrestling an angel. And in the end, he is he's lamed really by the angel, which is always a sign of a successful initiation. And the poet Rilke, years later, and I'm still responding to your question, Rilke years later said, actually, that is what we all long for, to be defeated decisively by constantly greater beings. Your angel should be too big for you. What you aspire to with beauty should be too big, almost too terrifying, almost too sublime for you. Otherwise, it's containable, and you have already reduced it and corralled it and controlled it. So that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of trouble that comes with beauty, because beauty is always going to ask something from you. Just turning my phone off. Beauty's talking to me on the phone now in the guise of my gorgeous daughter. But for now, I'll have to turn her off. So yeah, beauty is always going to ask something from you, and that's where the labor comes in. It's going to tell you, it's going to ask you to earn your name in some way.
Well, thanks, Martin. I know you've got a story in your pocket at some point when the time is right. And what comes to me actually too, before we get there, is this age. It feels like we're in an age of spectacle, right? Of this idea of a kind of dazzling spectacle alongside a constant seduction for attention, right? And in some ways, it feels to me that sense of seduction of beauty is, that which grabs our attention is somehow, right? There's value in that, or at least that's the kind of place we seem to find ourselves in. And yet, you're asking of a different fidelity to recognize beauty. And I wonder, what's the difference then between like spectacle and seduction, and as you call this, disciplined courtship of beauty?
It's interesting. A word I may use rather than spectacle would be ornamental. And that brings us into the visual appearance of things, because actually in the ancient world, things that were well made mattered. Making things by hand well really matter. Things visually looking and appearing aesthetically beautiful matters. In a lot of Russian fairy tales, there is a woman that lives at the very edge of the world called Vasilisa, and some say she is the soul herself. And if you want to court Vasilisa, you can't turn up with gold bullion, you can't turn up with cash, you can't turn up with stuff you bought in a mall. You have to turn up with things that you've made by hand. Now, this is a woman that when she marries is going to marry with a wedding dress with 10,000 secrets, feminine secrets sewn into it by her grandmothers and her aunts and the elderly women of her family. And so you're getting into mythic information, which is telling you, the recognition of beauty is important, but ultimately that isn't where it ends. Where it ends is when you make it, you learn to respond to it, and you take on, and this is what I've been getting at for the last 10 minutes, the difficult labor of a craft. So you begin to actually pass something on. So there is a relationship between the outside and the inside. The problem now is, I've said before, and this is ironic, bearing in mind who's just stepped back into the White House, many of us have fake news from our own psyche. In other words, we hypnotize ourselves. We're always slagging our partners. We're always writing Facebook memes about how dreadful everybody else is. Take account for a moment. Do a pretty sobering account of your own nature and character. This includes myself, of course, and get right with your own soul, get right with your own levels of integrity, because then the outer and the inner begin to align, and something can be visually beautiful and can be displayed. But when the disconnect happens, when things become toxically, I guess is the rather overused expression, toxically beautiful, it's
Mm,
because there is an absence inside. I'll finish with an image that's quite meaningful for me at the moment. In the 4th century, around the 4th century, there was a mystic that lived out in the deserts of Egypt, Antony of the desert. He was what they call a desert father. And he had a mountain or a big hill next to the Nile. And you could visit Antony at that mountain. It was called the Exterior Mountain. And everybody did. And because he was a gregarious and a kind man, you could visit Antony there. And for most people, the Exterior Mountain was all they needed to know about this Middle Eastern mystery religion called Christianity and Antony and the rest of it. That was enough. But what fewer people knew about or were even interested in is that miles behind the Exterior Mountain, further out into the desert, down a much, much more severe path, was a place called the Interior Mountain. And the Interior Mountain was where Antony spent most of his time and work. And that is where he gained his, profound spiritual fiber. And I have a longing in middle age to be in
mm,
contact with the Interior Mountain, not the Exterior Mountain.
mm,
And that produces beauty of quite another level. I've said before, and this is not original to me, many other people have come to similar conclusions, that the first half of life is almost by nature developing something of the chameleon. You can bob and weave in lots of circumstances because life is asking so much from you, whether you're at
mm,
school or relationships. But things that were charming when you were 16 are really gauche when you're 55. And you
mm,
make that move that most of us are trying to make from persona to presence, from persona to presence. And that for me is the move from the Exterior Mountain to the Interior Mountain.
mm,
And that's going to produce, without a covenant, again, forgive me, you've heard me say this before, without a covenant with limit, ironically, you're not going to get the kind of beauty that you're actually looking for. Isn't that
mm,
interesting? In middle age, I am now limited by my choices. I can't do all the things I wanted to do when I was 25. My body's not behaving in the way I hoped it was when I was that age. But in the limiting, I deepen. And in the deepening, I encounter the beauty that I've always longed to be around. But it comes with a certain degree of consequence. And that consequence means, as I've been saying since the book Scatterlings, you have traded a certain amount of exponential growth for more substantial depth.
mm. Well, Martin, it really strikes me this bridge then between your work in rites of passage and human making and this willingness to submit to limit and right all of this sort of mythic function of this ritual or whatever, however it might look. And so I wonder if you might speak to that a little before we get to the story of just how is a rites of passage and that whole process related to the capacity to cultivate, be with beauty, to name it, to recognize it. Yeah.
Of course, the beauty things comes from the fact that for the last 2 years, I've been thinking a lot about what have been the great themes in my own work. Most of us have 2 or 3 things that we're profoundly interested in, and we circle around them. That's what human beings do. You just try and be inventive with the circling to hopefully keep other people on board as well as yourself. But what I realized was the thing I've been interested in since I was about 23 was, how do you make a real human being? The first real human being I felt I ever met was a Lakota Sioux medicine man called Wallace Black Elk. And I was only around Wallace for 2 weeks. I didn't have any sort of particularly significant relationship with him, but it was enough for me to see what an initiated man looks like. And then, of course, growing up in the West, as I did, as many of us reading this do, you fall into a kind of a bit of a nervous breakdown, or certainly dismay, when you think, well, I'm
Mm.
not going to be wrestling with a lion. I'm not going to be out with the Maasai. I'm not going to be on the top of Bear Butte in the middle of a thunderstorm. What do I do to become real? Wallace was like the first real human being that I felt that I'd ever met, in a way. Well, once you are dealing with ideas as big as that, that can really knock you off your perch, and that can be appropriate for a while. But there's another word that is maybe more significant for me these days than a big word like initiation, and it's this word, tempering.
Mm.
Because actually, anybody, regardless of the culture you come from, can commit to a life where you gradually and on occasion abruptly temper your and develop your own character. And I think, despite the sort of tyranny of choice that we are being presented with on our screens most of the time, I think most of us are looking for a deeper life of one kind or another. And this notion of what identifies someone who's grown into the difficult shape of being a real human being, which is quite an achievement, partially that's your capacity in the end to recognize and deliver praise.
Mm.
And in myth, if you have no largesse, if you have no generosity, you could have all the money in the world and you are moribund. You're a dead person walking. They say of the character I mentioned a minute ago, Finn McCall, if the rivers of the world were spun of pure silver, if the leaves on the trees were spun of pure gold, Finn would have given them all away. Now, that is a Dalai Lama level insight
Mm.
from where I come from, because that's how I would want to live. And so the slow process of becoming a human being, which is I've just finished this book on that subject. Part of it is to do with this recognition that beauty is not just something that is beheld, it is something that is made. And the word itself implies courtesy and goodness front and center. I've been in love with the chivalric tradition since I was very, very small. I was one of those kids that was always chucking his coats over puddles and hoping girls would walk over the coats, as I've got older, there's only so many coats you can chuck down. But the essence of it comes down to this old idea, noblesse oblige. And noblesse oblige is wonderful. William Stafford wrote a poem about it once, actually. It ends with, maybe I'm a king, maybe you're a queen. Noblesse oblige just means this, that actually you have been dragged from the dung heap to dine with princes, and you have to learn to act accordingly. If you're going to feel noble, act noble, and not in some aerated colonistic type of way, but deep down in the profundity of whatever goodness is available to you.
Mm. Beautiful. I wonder, might it be time for the story now?
I think it is time for a story. So this will be new to you, I think, Ian. Certainly from my
Okay.
lips. Anyway, this is a story. It's not the saddest story I've ever told. It's not the funniest story I've ever told. It's deep, but it's deep in a way that is very approachable. This is a story you could
Mm.
tell with a 5-year-old would enjoy this story. So I'll tell it and let's see where we go with it. I won't say what it is because you shouldn't tell stories what they are. Okay, let's begin. This is a story that begins in the far east of England in an area called Norfolk. It's a large county. In Norfolk, there is a village, and the village is called Swaffham. And in Swaffham, there was a man called John. Now, if you asked his friends about him, if you said, is John terribly good looking? Is he dashing? They'd say, no, he's a plain lad. Okay. they'd say, has John been an inspirational mover and shaker in the establishment of the health of the village? They'd say, not really, he's kind of basic. That was how people saw John until the night when our tale begins. Because one night John was sleeping and John had a dream. Now, this wasn't the kind of dream you have when you've eaten too much cheese. This wasn't the kind of dream when you sit on a sofa and it tells you that it's your mother. This is what they call a big dream. And one of the ways you sometimes know you've had a big dream is that the dream is kind of direct. And in the dream, a man appeared to John, and the man was wearing a blue cloak, and he said this: "Go to London Bridge. Something good is waiting for you there. Go to London Bridge. Something good is waiting for you there." So the lad wakes up and he's, shaken by the dream. And he looks at his wife, who is profoundly asleep, and he thinks, there's nothing in the world, to the north, the south, the east, and the west, that my wife likes more than being woken up by me in the middle of the night for some dream interpretation. So he wakes her up. The great crow emerges and he says, darling, I'm ever so sorry to wake you up. Can I tell you my dream? And he tells her the dream. And then he says, I'm so baffled by it. What could it possibly mean? I just can't fathom the Gnostic implications of this dream. And she said, for goodness sake, it's the simplest dream I've ever heard of. Go to London Bridge where something good will happen. But anyway, it's probably not an important dream. Go back to sleep. He goes back to sleep and John has the same dream again. Okay. Now, once you've had the same dream twice, that has really got your attention. So he wakes up the next day. He sees the look in his wife's eye and he knows it's best not to inquire about the meaning for her. So he starts to walk around the village because he thinks, well, there's at least 30 people here that are effectively trapped in this village. I can ask everybody's opinion. And the longest day in Swatham's history began. First of all, he goes to the candlestick maker. He asks his opinion. He goes to the baker, asks her opinion. Goes to the butcher, the tailor, the tattoo parlor, the tavern, all of it. Asks everybody. And everybody kind of has a similar response. They're saying, actually, it seems profoundly simple, and it seems like you need to go on this trip to London Bridge where something good will happen. Well, he's done this all day long, and it's got to what here in Devon we call the Dimpsey time. The Dimpsey time, it's dusk, it's cocktail hour. It is the time, as they say, between dog and wolf. And he thinks he's run out of anybody to tell his dream to until finally his spirits lift, because at the very edge of the settlement is a church. Now, this church has seen better days. The church is absolutely collapsing. The roof is all kind of broken in. There's more crows than parishioners at this point. All the the gravestones are kind of keeling over. There's a low mist. It looks like an early 70s folk horror movie. That's what it looks like, a bit Wicker Man-esque. And wandering out of the church like Nosferatu himself is the priest. And the priest looks down at John with the priest's pale, watery eyes, and he says, what are you doing here? And he says, well, I wondered if you could help. I've had a dream. I'd love it if you had a take on what the dream means. And he tells the dream yet again to the priest. And the priest looks at him and says, well, he says, I've heard one dream after another in my many years of confession. But look at the church. He gestures at this moment. There was a time when this place was full of parishioners and there was music here and laughter and happiness and storytelling and prayers and goodness. And the whole thing has just fallen to pieces. What I need is a vision for this place, not your dream. Jog on, as we say in England. So John jogs on and he goes home and his wife says to him, listen, I've packed you some sandwiches. I've put 5 gold coins in your purse. Leave tomorrow. Take the dog. Leave me with the 2 kids. Go to London and try and decipher what this enters, enter the reality of the dream, walk the path of the dream, and let's see what is revealed. And so, God bless her with her largesse, with her generosity, looking after the kids. The next day, John sets off. Well, John had never really left the village before. And for the first few hours of traveling, he's quite impressed with himself because actually, as he puts one step in front of another, he feels happy, he feels excited about what he's going to see round the bend. His little dog, yip, 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 is with him, and everything is still pretty familiar. He sees smoke. He sees Norfolk smoke coming from Norfolk chimneys. He sees the corn in the fields. The farmers are waving at him. He thinks, wow, I think I'm quite the traveller. Who knew? Who knew what a traveller John was? Well, the weather turns, doesn't it? And he spends a few nights sleeping in a ditch, and his poor dog is getting a bit skinny, and the cheese sandwiches get ate, and a lot of the money gets spent. There's a strange detail in the story that he met a woman on the road to London who offered him a ticket to heaven. And he bought that ticket and parted with almost what was left of his available cash. Quite what a ticket to heaven is, I do not know. Well, by now he's far away from anything that is familiar at all. And he gets to the road that leads to London that is known by local people as the Gold Road. The Gold, well, that sounds good, doesn't it? And after a couple more days, he can smell something on the breeze. Back in the day, you see, London town, it was a place you smelt rather than saw. And he sees it's the biggest settlement he's ever seen. He can see that smoky, snaky old River Thames passing through the center of it. And he can see, blows his mind, houses with more than one layer to them, like houses going up in the air, and there's people peering out and they're chucking pots of things that are disgusting out onto the path in front of him. But him and the dog keep going, keep going. They ask people until finally they get to London Bridge. Well, he stands around as you would have stood around, and he says, I'm here, dazzle me. And it's then that he realizes that his dream, although on the one hand, it's kind of precise, in other rather crucial ways, it's slightly vague. Something good will happen. So now the big wait begins, because we don't know what the good thing is going to be. And the poor lad sits there with his dog, and the rain comes and the sleet comes and maybe a few flakes of snow come, even if it's not that time of year, and on it goes. And he's pretty miserable now. He's got very little to support him. And he gets homesick. He's one of those homesick characters. And one day he actually sees a whole bunch of pilgrim people making their way to a little settlement called Norfolk, where my sister lives, funnily enough, making their way out of London in the opposite direction. And frankly, he wishes he was going with them. About 5 days have passed. Apparently, he spent his last coin paying for a bear to dance in front of him. Oh, that poor bear. And so he's sitting there, and the dog is sitting there, and they're both miserable. And there's a guy who works in a shop across the road. And he comes over to him and he says, I have to ask, his London accent, I have to ask, you've been there for 4 days. You look absolutely miserable. Why are you here? May I inquire? And John says, well, I had a dream. And it told me I had to come to London Bridge because something good would happen. And the man, he looks down at John and he laughs. He says, dreams! Dreams, you idiot. Dreams are just the right brain talking to the left brain and back again. Dreams mean absolutely nothing. I tell you this, I had a dream myself. Only last night, a ridiculous dream. I can't even believe I'm bothering to tell you the dream, but I'm telling it to you to prove how ridiculous dreams are. The dream was, well, it wasn't even in London. It wasn't even in a place I've ever been before. It was in a place called Norfolk, and in Norfolk there was a place called Swaffham, tiny little dump of a place. And in Swaffham there was a cottage that belonged to a man, Jimmy or James or Johnny perhaps. And in the garden of the cottage there was a small blackthorn tree. And underneath that tree in the ground, you didn't have to dig for very long, was a cauldron absolutely filled with gold, more gold than you could possibly spend. You see, dreams mean absolutely nothing. And with that, poof, off he goes. And John absorbs it and he goes, yeah, maybe dreams really do mean nothing. And he sits and he carries on waiting. He keeps waiting. And then after a while, he begins to speculate on the dream. And he thinks, oh, that's weird. Swaffham. Well, I come from Swaffham. Little cottage. I have a little cottage. Well, my name is John. I have a bush just like, oh my God, oh my Lord, oh my Lord. And he grabs the dog. He says, it's happened, it's happened, it's happened. Lightning has struck. My life has been opened to possibility at last. The thing I had to receive here, having travelled so far from home, is the thing that I most profoundly need is at home. Come on, we're going home. Yip, 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 says the dog. And the two of them charge out of London. There's no evidence they ever went back, in fact. And they ran and they ran and they ran and they ran, didn't they, down the Gold Road. And as they were running down the Gold Road, a bit like a cartoon at this point, John thought to himself, isn't it ironic that I thought the Gold Road would be pushing to London, but the Gold Road is actually going in the opposite direction? And they keep going and they keep going. And after a few days, they see the Norfolk smoke coming from the Norfolk chimneys, and the Norfolk kids are dancing around the dog, and the people are in the fields and they're well, hello, John, you've come back. Well, he runs into the house. He runs to his wife, Yvonne. He runs to his children, who are called, I am improvising this, they're called Ichabod and Hagar. And he grabs them and he gives them 2 spades. And he says, come out into the garden immediately. We've got spade work to do as a family. It's time for us to bond. And so they all start to dig. They don't quite know why they're digging at this point, but they dig deep into the soil. And sure enough, just as the dreamer said back in London, it only takes 5 minutes before there is the satisfying thwunk of metal on metal. And sure enough, there is a cauldron. That was the dream. And they pull out of the ground all of this gold. I mean, it is extraordinary. No one in their family, no one in their father or mother's family going back 1,000 years has received any kind of good news like this. But they notice something. They notice on the edge of the cauldron, there's some words in Latin. And they say to each other, well, there's only one person who knows Latin in the village. It would be the priest. Let's write the words down and see if he understands them. Because, you could imagine John had not received that kind of education. And so they run through the village. They've hidden the gold in the house. They run through the village, they run to the church, and they knock on the door. The door almost collapses. In there, with one candle rocking back and forward, is the freezing, watery-eyed priest. And they say to him, can you tell us what these words mean? And he reads it and he says, yes, I can tell you. What that says is this: under me is something richer. Under me is something richer. Well, by now they're getting used to metaphorical language, aren't they? They're getting used to the twists and turns of the universe. And they grab the priest and they say, come with us. And they start to dig and they start to dig and they start to dig. And within 5 minutes of little Ichabod, little Hagar, little Yvonne, and little John digging and digging and digging, they come to a second cauldron. And they unearth this cauldron. And this has just as much, if not more money than the one before. And the most wonderful thing happens at this point in the story. As they saw this second fortune, they knew that this wasn't for them. They knew to take this second cauldron into their life would have abused some sort of relationship that had led them to this moment. And they said, no, this money is not ours. The other stuff is ours, but this isn't for us. And they turned to the priest and they said, well, priest, how much money would it cost to bring back the church to vivid health? The priest said, well, it would take a lot of money. And we'd need everybody in the community to help us. We'd need the candlestick makers. We need the bread makers. We'd need the vintners. We need the ones that can prepare the roof. We need to make a new creche for the kids. We need a new choir, etc., etc. Where could that money come from? John, of course, looked at him and said, come from my dream, it did. It came from my dream. And he holds up that shimmering, energy-giving, life-giving gold. Well, I tell you, the old priest did something that no one had ever seen to that day. He started to smile. It's odd when crows smile because he's like a big crow, this fella. But he started to twist and turn and smile. I mean, it's fair to say the smile may have been more alarming than his face when it was more serious. But he started to do his strange little ecstatic crow dance in the garden. And then the kids started to kind of come along, wah, 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 and they're doing it, and everybody's doing it. By now, the whole village have turned up. They've got the story very quickly, and everyone is realizing that suddenly health has found its way back to Swaffham through following the dream of really a very simple human being, John. And everything they needed was right underneath their feet. Well, it was a marvelous few years, the restoration of that village and the gainful employment of everybody in that village. And, you know, churches should never be, holy places should never be so well made that every few years they don't start to fall down again. And everybody has to be called upon to rebuild the thing, to redream the thing, to hope the thing, to regrieve the things that are leaving, but be open to the spirit that is arising. Well, John never had a dream like that again. He just didn't. But when people spoke about John in the future, they'd say, yeah, John wasn't the most bonny. He wasn't the most pretty of men. He wasn't always the most imaginative, but he is John of the dream. John of the dream. So that is my little story.
Mm. One of the one of the sadnesses I have is that you can't see me and probably everybody else tuning in, chuckling along and smiling, and as I was throughout that whole story, particularly the dancing bear. But poor dancing bear. I just have no doubt that's how people are experiencing the story, and I wonder, just before we step in further, to maybe dare I say, unpack. But sometimes I believe you ask, and storytellers might ask, where do you find yourself in the story, right? Where it might have got you, and I just wonder for the listeners if they might take a moment, maybe even chat in the comments. You could just say, this is where I'm at in that story. This part grabbed me.
Yeah, it's a brilliant idea, and if you do it, just name the image. Don't name your idea about the image. Just name the moment. Just keep it super compressed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So where do you find yourself, Ian? Are you a dancing bear?
Well, it does make me think of a very recent story, though. It's just the idea of leaving to find the thing that's under your doorstep. And I recently locked my keys in my car, last week, and it basically kicked off a very similar kind of romp through many people looking for support and all the rest. And it became this kind of enlivening something that was, included me in my carelessness, but also much more than that. And so I'm just kind of with that sense of this rejuvenation happening by leaving and returning to the thing that's right there. Also the crow dance of the village is quite a thing to wonder about. Yeah.
I find myself struck this time with the value of the journey.
Mm,
The irony, of course, is that it was always there, but without the journey, without the change of perspective, without the experience that he has of leaving the Shire, as it were, he's never going to be able to come back somehow. Well, he never would have known. He never would have known quite what was under his feet. And there will be some very well traveled people watching us right now. And I'd ask you all to think about your own journeys, the places that you've been, the insights that may have come about your home ground when you're up in the Himalayas, or you're on a beach in Jamaica, or you're trying to make things work on the third shift in a cafe in Detroit, you know,
mm,
where
mm,
people find themselves. I love that though, because that's a real folk tale. That's a real folk tale. That's the kind of story you tell when you've got 5 miles between one settlement and another, and you got to keep the mood lively.
mm,
It's not necessarily. I wouldn't want to hang a whole conference on it. I wouldn't want to do that to it. It's not. That's not its wingspan, but it's
mm,
profound. It's
mhm,
profound in its way. It has all sorts of juice if you just spend time with it.
mhm. I'll say too, there's quite a bit coming in. I can just rattle off a few here. Some people saying, the moment the realization John needed to head back home. Someone else is at the London Bridge. The wee dog, dig deeper. The wife, right? Asleep and dreaming. John. Yeah, really great comments there from people coming in. And I wonder for you too. There is this parallel too. I think of this sense of it might be kind of efficient, or it'd be efficiency would say, oh, it was right there the whole time. You didn't need to go on the trip. Right. Therefore, in the future, just dig where you are. It's also missing the thing, right? Because again, you speak of this idea of tempering,
Yeah.
right? And maybe in the sense that he couldn't have recognized what was under his feet without the journey as well, right? This prophetic willingness to follow the mystery.
As I was telling the story this evening, I suddenly realized that this, in a way, is the essence of my book, Smoke Hole.
Mm,
A lot of what Smoke Hole is about is this story, although I wouldn't have been, I've only been telling this story very recently. Um, and I think that you're right. Some stories, it's interesting as a storyteller, I've been talking about this. Some stories have a nomadic agency, they're designed to travel, and other stories are stories with a zip code attached to them. They have an address attached to them. And this story has place names in it. Swaffham is a place. I was in Swaffham 3 weeks ago. There's all sorts of little twists and turns that make it regional. However, there's no doubt about it, this story also belongs to what you could call the commons of the imagination, which is the fairy tale and folk tale tradition. So there is bound to be a John of Swaffham, but it is, it's John of Stockholm, or it's a John of Helsinki, or it's a John of Ceredigion, or something like that. It's also a story you can feel is robust enough to travel from place to place.
mm, thanks, Martin. So I wonder if we might open it up to a few
Of
questions to
course.
bring on, and maybe the
Yeah,
next
yeah.
15. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, folks tuning in live, again, thank you for doing so. And if there's questions that you wanted to bring on stage, we certainly probably won't get to too many, but at least a few that might spring to our attention here. Feel free to drop it in the comments. And I wonder actually if could this be a time to offer the news, as we're also waiting for somebody to say, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do it now because then we can move to questions. I'm also pleased to share that Martin has agreed to come once again to the Western Shores of Canada to join us over here for a few shows to be announced in the future. But for those of you in this region or close enough that you can make the journey, as perhaps John has done up here to find some gold in this region of Western Canada, then please feel welcome to join us. I'm just going to drop a link in the chat in the comments, and that's where you can go there actually to sign up to be the first to hear about these events that are going to be happening. This is in May, so we got a few months still until that, but yeah, we had such a fun time last time, Martin. Quite ambitious with a tour right across Canada.
Mm.
That was, I appreciate your willingness to do that and all of the in between moments and everything that got you there. But we're going to focus now a little bit to a smaller region, but still unfold some big stories and some big time together. Do you want to say anything about that before we get to the question?
Yeah, it's going to be called To Fall Beautifully from the Edge of the World. And it has some fairly ambitious things happening. I'm going to tell for the first time in Canada the entire Grail Epic of Parsifal, the whole thing. Now, anybody that knows me, this is not for the faint-hearted. This is an enormous labor. And it'll take me, we'll be working in and around it for the best part of 3 to 4 days, I think. During that period, I will also be relating this big myth, which Joseph Campbell in particular thought was the great underpinning myth of what he calls Occidental mythology. It's up there with something like the Odyssey, and filled with women, by the way. Don't get deceived by thinking it's just about this guy Parsifal. So it's an amazing thing to travel through a story for days, not just hours or not just moments. My work really is as a long distance runner when it comes to myth telling. That's where I'm at my best. So we are going to be traveling for one intensive gathering all the way through Parsifal, the great Grail story of someone called Wolfram von Eschenbach. He's the first guy that writes it down anyway in that form. There is also, I think, Ian, going to be is it in Vancouver we're doing the big gig?
That'll be on Vancouver Island, actually. Yeah.
On Vancouver Island. And there will also be a day gathering for men. It'll be the first men's gathering that I think I've done probably in maybe since before lockdown. So maybe 6 years. And I'm really in love with the story of Gawain and the Green Knight. And I'm in love with the notion of how could modern people, modern men, take the notion of chivalry seriously? What could that look like? And how do you build out of something that is not just random grandiosity, but actually has some real grit and some grace attached to it? So we will be exploring this whole story of Gawain and the Green Knight with that front and center in our imagining. So there's a whole bunch of things coming. I mean, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. So yeah, I dropped the link in the chat for folks if you want to sign up to be notified more clearly about the events when tickets are on sale, all that stuff. So please stay tuned there. And to a few questions we got here. So one here is from Jacob, actually, Jacob Bush. He says, here, I'll bring it on screen. How do you fix a broken beauty? I just thought that was an interesting way of phrasing it. And I wonder what you might say.
How do you fix a broken beauty? Well, of course, we immediately think about Leonard Cohen, don't we? And, the cracks letting in the light and things like that. I'd also give you a very quick bit of Rumi. If you haven't been fed, become bread. So find a place where you feel broken. And if it is to do with, say, a deficit of affirmation, or to use a big word, blessing in your life, make sure you get on the receiving end of giving it to others. You can't wait continually to inherit something that has been denied you, because often what is going to be denied you can only come in the identifying of it and the giving of it to others.
Thanks, Martin. Here's a follow-up too here on beauty from David. Says, what could be a beauty found in the ordinary things, the essence?
It's interesting, David, when I am telling fairy tales, which are sometimes to do with a man or a woman being beheld by their partner for the first time, I'm always careful to describe them. I say, and he stood there in his ordinary beauty, or she stood there in her ordinary beauty. Otherwise, we are immediately stretching the story on the rack again of sort of, ornamental ideas that we may or may not feel that we live up to. Well, ordinary beauty. One of the most beautiful things, if I dare say it, one of the most beautiful things that I've ever done is be punctual at the school gates of my child. I made sure that for those years that she was at school, providing I was in the country, I was always there, because I think there's something about parenting. Bly said this to me, Robert Bly said to me, you have to know as an adult, and he meant this for men and women, not just for guys. You have to know as an adult, you have to be prepared to sacrifice a certain degree of excitement for being the kind of parent you need to be to that child. So when the day comes that they leave the settlement, when they go to London Bridge, they go cleanly because you are a resolved energy in their life. You are ordinary in a way. You are dad in a way. And so, I have enough razzle dazzle to be interesting, I'm sure, to my nieces and nephews and my beloved daughter, but predominantly a steadfastness. That's a good word. It's a word to write down if you've got your journal. Steadfastness is something that, again, it's like fidelity. It's these old fashioned words that are often the most beautiful qualities of all. And when you notice it in somebody, it may not be so dramatic, but it's the long lasting stuff. That's my response.
Thanks, Martin. Here's a question in from Mary who says, here, I'll bring it on screen. How does relief to the current moment in time come from, or come through story? I think she meant to say, maybe can relief come through story? Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. Well, one of the reliefs that comes through story for me in moments like this is the fact that the stories we remember are generally not the stories when today was like the day before. They're the day when something unexpected happens. And we're certainly living in very, very unexpected moments. So, in other words, myths often begin when we feel outnumbered and outgunned. I'm sorry to use a military reference, when we feel outnumbered. But the poet Goethe says to us, be bold in such times, because in boldness, invisible forces will come to your aid. And again, I know that sounds highfalutin and poetic, but what the hell else would anybody think they're going to get from me? I like highfalutin poetic things because I actually believe in them. So I think appropriate grief is a very legitimate currency to get to know. But I don't think, for me, despair is an energy I want to be around for very long. I just find it so absolutely disabling. And then I cease in my function to be useful and of service to other people. And I am really in a vow of service with the years that I have left. I want to be useful, actually. So the way the stories help is they put us in conditions of peril. That's usually where they begin. And they are all about this very simple phrase, again, which I overuse: no pressure, no diamond. And that's what I'd ask us all to think about today at the beginning of this presidential run. What is the appropriate pressure that you are going to allow into your life? And what is the diamond or daimon or angel or beauty that could be created? Wouldn't that be an incredibly countercultural act in the face of diminishment and depression, to aikido that move into something that produces more beauty, more vitality, as the Irish would say, more crack in the world? Crack is a lovely thing. Look for things that have crack in them, that have lively spirit in them. And if there isn't much of that in your life, go to the places that you remember it's given to you. That could be music, it could be art, it could be friendships, it could be animals. I always, when I'm overwhelmed, I go to the sea. I grew up by the sea. I go and sit in the oceanic splendor of water. I've just finished this book about becoming a human being, about why beauty matters. And in the book, at the very end, I wrote this sentence, and it's a strange sentence. I barely understand it myself. It says this: in each experience of beauty, we are being prepared for eternity. In each experience of beauty, we are being prepared for eternity. You know, I wrote it down, and that was my life's work in one sentence. Now, what do I mean when I say eternity? I'm a Christian, so eternity has a certain kind of resonance. But in the wider scheme of everybody's listening, what on earth does eternity mean? Well, I suppose in the simplest way I could say it, it's where we go or what happens when we die. And I have no interest in cultivating medieval Baroque images of either angels on clouds or pitchforks or any of that stuff. What I am intrigued by is the notion in our lives that the place where we put our attention, where we put, God willing, our creativity and our goodness, builds up energy almost like a magnet, and we are going to find ourselves propelled in that direction at the end when we move into the mysteries. And the mysteries are something I can't say much about because I'm not dead. So I'm not trying to sort of lay a theory over us, but I like the idea in encounters with beauty and learning to cultivate it. We prepare, hopefully we make a beauty trail for the life beyond this one. Okay, so that was a rather mystical answer at the end, but there you go.
Thanks, Martin. How much time do you have to grant us here?
Another one or two questions.
Okay. You responded to a few that I felt actually were kind of naturally. One was, well, I'll just bring it on screen. This is from Eric. He says, basically, I grieve I've never found a handcraft. I spent my life in the work of the mind, and I find myself looking as a latecomer for some craft to court in many paths, and where does one find the trailhead? So I just want to hold that for a second. And then another question from someone who basically said, how to advise to connect with one's daemon as well, right? This, maybe I hear the same kind of question, like how do you find that path to that deeper genius or the muse or the beauty or the handwork? Yeah.
Seamus Heaney, one of the great Irish poets of the last 50 years, I think was always slightly ashamed that he couldn't handle a spade like his father and his grandfather could handle a spade. But in one of his most famous poems, he realized that the pen was his spade. The pen was his spade. And actually, he was wasting valuable energy beating himself up over the fact that he wasn't going to be his granddad. He wasn't going to be his great granddad. He was going to be Seamus fucking Heaney, actually. You know, he was going to do something that no one in his family had seen before. And so, whilst on the one hand, I recommend, skills like that. I'm very, very basic. I just whittle. I just love to whittle. I love to whittle sticks. Sticks take me about 5 days, and then I give them away to somebody, and then the next. And they don't have any real kind of artfulness to them, but they have a lot of attention and a lot of love. I'm a great believer in starting late. And as Robert Motherwell, the artist, once said, art is the enemy of the well-made. That's something, isn't it? Art is the enemy of the well-made. And in a way, you have to allow yourself to be a righteous mess for a while, be a little pirate, to be a storyteller. The wonderful thing about being a storyteller is the older you get, the more credible you become. It goes very against what everything else is saying. Oh, wouldn't it be better if you were 22? Very few people really want to hear a storyteller when they're 22, but when they're 82, then we're going to sit at their feet and really listen in to the exfoliation of their imagination, going out and finding news of the universe. So that's all I can say, really, is try not to beat yourself up too hard. Many of us are in a similar situation, but James Hillman, the great psychologist, was always getting told he was too much of an intellectual. And on his 70th birthday, Michael Meade knows this story. I think Michael Meade was actually there. So get this out of Michael, the great Michael Meade. Hillman had learnt to tap dance without telling anybody. And he came out and he just did this funky little tap. He did his little crow dance He did his tap dance, and it just blew people's tiny minds. So stay eccentric, stay connected, as Hillman would say, to your freak fire. And it may be that you become a great maker of boats, but it may be that you're a poet. But one way or another, keep staying curious. That's the thing about this life. When you lose curiosity for it, you are heading into an existential darkness that is very hard to come back from. Curiosity is king or queen.
Mm. Mm. Thank you, Martin. So I think there's maybe one more kind of
Yeah.
binding us to the moment question, and then one more that's very just nuts and
Okay.
bolts. Yeah. So this question too, which I feel comes from maybe your own journey in finding the cauldron beneath your feet of the
Yeah.
Christian soil,
Yeah.
right? That you've also grown up
Mm.
in and been on the trail of, and then also the times that we're seeing over in the U.S. And so it kind of begins where it brings us back to. But
Yeah.
fellow says, KM Rice, Martin, what do you make of the rise of Christian nationalism in the U.S.? He says, I'm not Christian, but I'm very
Yeah.
anxious about the way they're attempting to not succeeding. And I
Oh,
wonder how
yeah.
you might, make sense of that.
Yeah, it would make me anxious too. It would make me anxious too. Whatever you're anxious about, I'm anxious about it.
Hmm.
It's amazing. I would be honest, and I'd have to say that part of the success of churchianity in the last 2,000 years has been that it has been very effective at mobilizing the will centers of its believers as well as the heart centers, the will. There's something called the Great Commission, which is the idea that Christianity needs to be out and about in the world with a strong missionary oomph to it. Whilst I understand that to a degree, the ways it is often communicated itself has been absolutely grotesque. And I have nothing to do in my own life or practice. I'm connected to a very sort of mystical and ancient form of Christianity, which is far to the east, really. So you have my sympathies. I find it depressing, and it's all to do with, as I said, people looking for certainty. In Eastern Orthodoxy, our understanding of God is profoundly mysterious, and there's a lot of that character that we couldn't possibly hope to know. But a lot of people want certainty. I come from a religious life that is far less to do with sermons and preachers and far more to do with what we call liturgy. The divine liturgy, which is the center of Orthodox life, is a very slow form of dance. And when we read from the Bible, generally we sing. So the theology is a sung theology. The movement is a form. Well, it's a form of dance. So I wouldn't know too much about that other side. Sorry, I'm going into a history lesson, so I must stop. Since the schism between East and West in Christianity, and then especially the Reformation, there are thousands of different variants of what people call Christianity. And I wouldn't have a great deal of knowledge about them. But as I said, whenever the will is being activated rather than essentially love in action, then I am nervous myself.
Mm. Mm. Thanks, Martin. And certainly a lot of these themes will be touched on in the forthcoming Fugitive Futures
Oh,
beginning
sure.
next week.
Good.
And one little quick one is actually asked from Jose. Do you speak Spanish, or is there possible to get your work in Spanish?
No, Jose, maybe you're offering to be my new translator. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Not as yet, not as yet, but I am rooted in Lorca, Antonio Machado, Juan Ramon Jimenez, and others. So Spain is in the blood. I mean, it's actually in the blood. I've got a wee bit of it in me. I'm basically an Irish Viking flamenco dancer. That's basically a bit of Brit. So no, not at the moment.
Mm. Okay, the last question too, which I think speaks to the fidelity that you spoke of and the steadfastness. This is from the Wild-Hearted. They say, when that fidelity and steadfastness you speak of become perhaps a little too terrifying, what stories would you recommend to get us through to the other side?
You know, when when life is really overwhelming, and I've asked storytellers about this, especially if they're dealing with, say, an illness or a depression or something is really difficult in their life, go to small, warm stories that have a certain mammal companionship about them. Maybe, take the tent down a bit from the big myths and the epic stories into something that is a little bit more intimate. A story may be, maybe you want to find your own version of what is sometimes the story I told this evening is sometimes called The Peddler of Swaffham or John of the Dream. Stories that have warmth and clear, compassionate pressure points in them are going to heat you from the inside when you tell them, and they will reduce some of that excess nervous energy that if that's being put in you, that's an invasion. You don't want it. Okay.
Thanks, Martin. Well, I think we'll close it there then for now. Super appreciate your time. And I wonder, could you just speak about where folks can find you, of course, in your many books and
Please
lectures?
do. Yeah, I've written lots of books. You might want to go to Audible and find Smoke Hole or Courting the Wasp Twin. You can have me growling the books at you from beginning to end. If you really want to go where the buses don't park, go out and buy my book, which is coming out this week, paperback, Bard's Skull. It is my magnum opus. It's a difficult, strange, knotty book, not for the faint-hearted. Some of my books are bridges. Some of my books are leaps. The bridge books, the ways in, the gateway drugs, would be A Branch from the Lightning Tree, Caught in the Wild Twin, Smoke Hole. The stranger end of the game would be Bard's Skull, The Night Wages. That's a book about grief, really, if that's where you are, and a few others. If you really want to know where I am and what's going on in my head, become a paid subscriber for the price of one English pint a month to Substack, House of Beasts and Vines. That's where you get fresh audio from me every Sunday morning, new ideas, new essays, new fairy tales, new stories. There's continued opening up into what I call Wild Christ. All of that is there. So yeah, Substack, House of Beasts and Vines. And if you want to find out where you can catch me teaching or even come to my school, which I have on Dartmoor, drmartinshaw.com has everything at the top.
Once again, Martin, thank you so much for your time tuning us in. And yeah, pleasure to make our approach to the forthcoming Fugitive Futures.
Good.
So I'll bid you adieu for now.
For
And
now,
I'll say
and
a
I
few words. Yeah.
look forward to seeing you all. Seeing you at least in a few months, and I think hopefully more of our old friends and new ones.
May it be so. Well, once again, thanks for everybody for tuning in to this live conversation with Dr. Martin Shaw. And you're all invited, of course, to the Fugitive Futures Summit, which begins in just over a week. You can find it all online at thevillageoflovers.com/summit. And there's multiple ways to connect, multiple experiences to have there. There's workshops, there's more talks, integration spaces, musicians. It's going to be quite a gathering. So I hope to see you there. And once again, thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode